So now on Daf Hayim Gimel and Beis, the Gemara says the following: Bishlem Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish is the one who says that according to Reb Meir, if you have an Aver Meduldal, then it's Tameh. So we're gonna organize the Bryce and interpret it in the light of Lidivreya. Lidivreim Karmelahu Lididi Loshna Aver de Uba Loshna Aver de Behema. I would not make any distinction between the protruding limb and a dangling limb, the Aver Meduldal of the animal itself. Ki Adadi Ninu, they're both the same, and the Shechita cannot purify it. But according to your logic, in other words, that a dangling limb, which is part of the animal itself, should be purified by the Shechita, then how much more so should you concede that the protruding limb of the fetus is not purified by the mother's Shechita? It's not part of the mother's body. So the Brisa doesn't present a difficulty according to Reish Lakish. El Rabbi Yochanan Kasha. According to Rabbi Yochanan, we have a difficulty because Rabbi Yochanan is of the opinion that Kuliyamalo Pliga, dangling a limb, meaning a Aver Meduldal, is not purified by the Shechita. So how can Rabbi say in this Brisa that it is purified? Ela Yitmar, Hachi Yitmar. Now we have to reformulate the machlokas between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Reish and Rabbi Lakish, Kemachlokas be'ubrim, kach machlokas be'varim. Just like we have two opinions with regard to the limb that protrudes outside the womb, the limb of the fetus, whether or not the limb is purified through the mother's shechita, so too we're going to have the identical machlokes with regard to Aver Meduldal limbs that are dangling from the animal themselves, whether such limbs are purified by the animal's shechita. According to Rachamim, the shechita is going to be mitar midei tumas nefela. According to Reb Meir, it doesn't spare the dangling limb from acquiring this tumah. Rabbi Yochanan Omer, that's all according to Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan says machlokes be Aver de Ubar. The machlokes between Rabbi Meir and the Chacham is only with regard to the protruding limb. Aval Aver de Behema. Everyone's going to agree that if you have this limb from the animal, it's Aver Menachai. The shechita does not make it legally detached. And therefore, if it's not detached, then the shechita is considered like part of the animal, and the shechita could purify it from tumah. The shechita of the animal is effective in rendering the limb slaughtered insofar as tumah is concerned. So, although the limb cannot be eaten, but it's free from tumas nevela. And Reb Meir's statement in the Brisa that the dangling limb is purified is true even according to his own opinion. Right there. So now, Omar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, my time with Rabbi Yochanan, leave the Reb Meir. How do you understand the logic of Reb Meir according to the way Rabbi Yochanan interprets it? Why would Reb Meir rule that the shechita purifies that dangling limb of an animal when he holds that shechita cannot purify the protruding limb of the fetus? What's the difference? And the answer is habegufa hala begufa. The protruding limb is not part of the animal's body. Not like the dangling limb, which is part of the animal's body. Rabbi Yitzchak Rabbi Yosef Bar Yosef Rabbi Yochanan Akol Modim Shemisa Osa Nipul. If the animal drops dead of natural causes, then that which was extended before the death of the animal is Tomei. And why is it Tomei? Because it has the status of Eivir Ben Achai. However, ein shchitos nipul, but if he shechts the animal, so the animal didn't die of natural causes, but through shchita, then eino osa nipul. It's not considered detached. So apparently there's some sort of new halacha here. I think the Gemara on the next staff is going to derive from Sukkim that ein shchita osa nipol, and therefore the limb that was protruded is going to be treifa, not nevela. It's not aver menachai. For my askina, what's the case? Lema be aver de ubar. If you're talking about the extended limb of a fetus, and then Rabbi Yochanan wants to say, according to this transmission from Rabbi Yitzchak bar Rabbi Yosef, that misa osa nipol v'ein shchita osa nipol, and there's no argument about those principles. How could you say such a thing? Miflik polig, Rabban the Chachamim disagree explicitly whether or not the mother shchita affects the detachment and gives the status of that limb, the status of Ever Menachai, Ela be Ever de Behema. So by process of elimination, we can't be talking about Ever de Ubar, we must be talking about an Ever Meduldelis of the animal itself. And Rabbi Yochanan establishes that both Rabban and Chachamim hold that the status of this limb is going to be dependent upon whether the mother animal dies or is slaughtered. If the animal is slaughtered, then the limb is viewed as attached, right? We said ena osa nipol means it's not going to create detachment, and therefore it's completely tar. If the animal dies through other means, natural causes, then the limb is considered detached because misa osa nipol, and thus it's Ever Menachai, it's not Nevela. Now, let's just point out the difference between Ever Menachai and Nevela is that in the case of Nevela, if you chop off a piece of the basar, of the flesh of a Nevela, if it's got a kazayas value, then it's Tame and Metame. But in the case of Ever Menachai, if you cut off a piece of the flesh of the Ever Menachai off the limb, and you don't have all the conditions that necessary for Erev Menachai, in that case, then it would be the flesh that you took off of that limb would not be Erev Menachai. But in the case of Nevela, the flesh taken off of the Nevela is also Nevela. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, why do I need this Chiddush of Rabbi Yochanan that Misa, Osa Nepal, and Shchita, Eino Osa Nepal? Both these principles are explicit in Mishnayos. So we're going to start now with a Mishnah at the end of Chullin. What does it say there in the Mishnah? Misa Tanina, right? The Mishnah itself establishes that if the animal dies a natural death, and let's say it had both a limb that was protruded, maybe it had a piece of flesh that was dangling from it, Ever Medudeles, then Mesa habehema basatzar hechsher, veha-ever mitame mishum Ever Menachai. But eino mitame mishum Ever Menachai did Reb Meir. Reb Meir is telling us that if the animal dies of natural causes, not through shchita, then that piece of flesh, the Ever Meduldal, is only susceptible to Kabbalah's Tumah if it had one of the Sheva Machshir, Via Aver, Mitame Mishum Aver Menachai. It's interesting because it seems that for Aver Menachai you don't need a Machshirin, but I think we'll have to get to that later. The Eino Mitame Mishum Aver Menanavela, Divrei Rabbi Meir. It's not an Aver Nevela. Why? Because we're talking about Mesa. It died of natural causes, and there was no shechita. So we now have half of what Rabbi Yochanan established right here in our Mishnah. That's as far as Misa Osa Nipo. Shchita Nami Tnina. Now we get to the second ruling of Rabbi Yochanan. That too we find in the very same Mishnah. And what does it say there with regard to the shchita, whether it creates detachment, right? That's nipol for dangling limbs, Ever Hamadudeles. And here we're going to say Ena Osa Nipol. Nishchata Behema, Hukshara B'domeha, Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rav Shimon Omer Lo Hukshu. So the blood of the shchita, which blood is one of the seven machshirin, is going to be machshir this dangling limb, the Sever Midudelis. He says here, since the blood that spurts out during the shechita touches the animal's meat, and the dangling limb and flesh are attached to the main body of the meat, Rav Meir deems them to have also made contact with the blood, and that's machshir them to kabel tuma. Since Rav Meir deems the dangling portions to be really susceptible to tum on account of having received preparation, we see that they are not inherently tomei as an Avram and a Chai. Which means that even Reb Meir, who maintains that shechita is ineffective with respect to purify the protruding limb of the fetus, concedes that it is effective insofar as purifying the dangling limb of the animal itself. So now the Gemara wants to have a trichusa, meaning it's not enough that we had these two Mishnayos, we still need Rabbi Yochanan. What? If we only had the Mishnah that says that Hukshra b'domea, my Hukshra abasar, maybe we would say it's only referring to the dangling flesh of the animal, but not to a dangling limb. And that means I would have argued that according to Reb Meir, Shechita does effectuate detachment, Shechitosa nipol, as far as the dangling limb and flesh are concerned. Therefore, the limb would be inherently tame, like a limb torn from a living creature. So that would be Avram and Achai. But the dangling flesh would not be inherently tame because it can't be Avram and Achai. It doesn't have bones. It doesn't have sinews. And therefore be tar. So again, this is all the Havamim if I didn't have the Mishnah. The flesh would rather be susceptible to tum in the manner of foods, b'toras ochel, would require preparation of a machshir by a liquid, And Rameir basically is telling us that dangling flesh is deemed to have been prepared and had a hechsher kabel tumah by the animal's own blood during its shechita. Even though, by the way, that blood did not necessarily have a contact with the dangling limb. Or let's say with the flesh, I should say. The dangling limb would be inherently tame. So what are we saying now? What are we saying now? We're saying that I would have said, according to Rabbi Meir, that shechita effects detachment. So therefore, the aver meduldal would be tame because it's already detached, and the shechita cannot be mitayre because it's already detached. So what's the chiddush Rabbi Yochanan? He wants to tell us that shechita ena osa nipul for the dangling limb. So it's not nipul, it's not detached, then it's still considered part of the animal, and therefore the limb is tar. Again, it could become tame if it's got a machshir. So again, the bottom line here is that the Havamina was that Rabbi Meir is only referring to a dangling flesh, but not to a dangling limb, which means it should have used the singular. Vaha hukshu Tani, the Gemara objects. It says hukshu in the plural. Mao did Taimai would have said chad lebasar aparish min behema, v'chad lebasar aparish min aver. There's flesh that's separated from the animal, and there's flesh that is separated from the limb, meaning the aver meduldal that's been dangling from the animal. Reb Meir would therefore mean that the dangling flesh of the animal itself and any flesh that might later be torn from the dangling limb was prepared for tumah the hechsher through the blood that spurted during the animal's shechita. And why do we need both the flesh of the animal and flesh that's torn from the aver meduldal? My ulmei hai mihai. Why is flesh that's torn from the limb stronger than the flesh directly from the animal? That we need to mention both of them specifically in the language of the grammatical plural. Salket, I would have thought, Ho'il mitami tumachamur agav aviv. The flesh that's torn from the dangling limb has a severe degree of tumah initially when it is together with its parent, meaning when it's part of the limb. For at that point, it's inherently Aver Menachai, Ema Loli Boy Hechsher. Maybe Aver Menachai is so chamur that it doesn't even require any of the machshir. It could be kabel tumah even when it's dry. And again, in the Havmina, we don't require preparation by a liquid in order to make this susceptible to tumah, because other foods have a less severe degree of tumah, and therefore you need a hechsher. So again, the Havamina is that the flesh torn from a dangling limb is less in need of hechsher for tumah than loose flesh that has been dangling directly from the animal. Kamash Malon, that's what Meir wants to teach us. That is incorrect. And he uses the plural they to include the flesh torn from the dangling limb, and it's all deemed to be prepared by the tumah, for tumah, by the blood of the animal itself. So Reb Meir would thus mean to allude that advanced preparation is necessary even for the flesh of the dangling limb. In any event, according to this interpretation, Reb Meir is using the plural form deliberately to be understood as referring to the flesh dangling directly from the animal and any flesh that's torn from the dangling limb. However, in the case of the dangling limb itself, he would not be referring to that because that limb is inherently tameh. Shchita affects detachment because Rabbi Shita is a shchitos and nipo, makes it inherently tameh like a Avrim and Achai. Therefore, it's necessary for Rabbi Yochanan to inform us that the shchita does not effectuate nipo, and instead it purifies the dangling limb of an inherent tumah. Even a dangling limb does not become tmeya unless she was prepared through moistening, meaning through one of the shiva mashkin, and then touches the source of tumah. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yosef will just finish this up. That Nekot to Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef Biyodcha, in other words, take seriously that which Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef taught us, because Rabbi Bar Bachana Kavasi has support from Rabbi and his Bryce. What do we have in the Braisu? Basar basada trefilos ochelu. Lahavi ha'ever v'abasa medudolim v'behem v'chai ushchatan. He had a limb or loose flesh that's dangling, ever medudol, from behem v'chai and he shechted it. Shein asurin. Right, that which is dangling is asur b'achilu. V'yomar Rabbi Baruch Hanom Rabbi Yochanan. Ein bohem el mitzvahs prosh bilvad. The dangling limb and the flesh are actually subject only to a drabanan. That's called mitzvahs prosh, a rabbinic commandment to separate oneself from them, but on a deraisa level they're mutter. And according to Rabbi Barbachona's quotation, Rabbi Yochanan holds that the shechita renders the dangling limb permitted for consumption on a doraisa level, and that accords with the teaching of Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef that according to Rabbi Yochanan, shechita does not affect attachment for dangling limbs, but rather purifies them of tumah. Okay, then this is where we'll stop.
Okay, thank you very much.
Because we did the daf.